Thanks for joining me here on Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, the founder of Bare Bones Yoga. I'm an experienced registered yoga teacher with over 15 years of teaching experience, a certified personal trainer, and an entrepreneur. My mission, what I stand for, is this: to help you develop into a purpose-driven, confident yoga teacher. One who truly understands anatomy and how to share it clearly and effectively so that you can help your students learn and, as a result, grow your impact and connection. This mission reflects the core ways of being that I work to develop in teachers: confidence, clarity, purpose, impact, and connection. Through my mentorship program and my premier offer called the Blueprint Learning Program, I help yoga teachers build their skills in the area of learning anatomy, and along with that, help them learn important business skills and personal development ways of being that will transform them into purpose-driven teachers who make a big impact. On the podcast here, you'll get a blend of both anatomy learning, stories from teachers, interviews with others in the field and beyond, and a dose of personal development. For more information on my programs, please see my website, barebonesyoga.com. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, and this is episode 76. So I hope you and your family are doing well, and your friends and those around you are doing well as well. As I record this, we are still living in a world where COVID is part of our daily reality, although on some level, and of course, depending on where you live, statistics are starting to show things trending in the right direction. Now, I know for me here in Boston today, I'm recording this on May 18th, 2020, and today marks the start of the state's reopening plan in a phased-in approach. I mean, for me, I'm looking forward to a safe reentry, doing all I can to stay safe and healthy, and I wish you the best wherever you live on this score as well. So today I'm going to share with you my takeaways from my second, albeit virtual, cadaver lab dissection training. So I'll start out by saying that while the idea of this kind of thing may sound a little bit triggering to some, I really encourage you to keep an open mind. And I'll explain more about the mechanics of it to address what I'm sure is a sense of inquisitiveness around how is it even possible that a yoga teacher, not a clinician, even has access to a recently deceased person for educational purposes in the dissection lab. If you're a bit squeamish, I suppose on some level, hearing about this on a podcast is probably the easiest way to introduce yourself to this concept. However, even with that, I promise you the amazing things you'd learn by participating in a training such as this are so life-changing that you quickly move past uncomfortable feelings and any uncomfortable feelings you might initially have. Now, in recent episodes, I've been sharing that my new free video training on understanding the why behind the cues is out. And I'm excited to say I've also written an ebook by the same name that you can get on Amazon for only $5.95. I know that sometimes people prefer books to videos, so for the readers out there, the book is out. Let me also remind you that this book, or the video training, if that's how you consume the content, is meant to share with you my proprietary system of how I decode or decipher cues. It's built on my anatomy knowledge as well as my knowledge in exercise science, taking into account anatomy, biomechanics, and its application specifically to yoga practice. It's a way for you to learn how to be more independent in understanding the cues you use, and a way for you to identify if you've got more anatomy to learn. And what an empowering revelation that is. It is not meant to go over dozens of cues. In fact, there are only 2 cues in the book that I run through in the context of reviewing the system. However, I have reviewed many examples in my Facebook Lives in my anatomy work group. So between the book or the video training and the Facebook Live videos, you'll have lots of examples to go through. Now, keep in mind, all that I offer you is a way for you to be more independent, more knowledgeable, and grow your impact. I am not focused on doing endless how-to videos to cover every single aspect of anatomy. Providing you with a systematic way to learn anatomy via my Blueprint Learning Program, supporting your further growth at a higher level through my 6-month mentorship program, and then even beyond my certification program and via that, all of those things will give you the tools, and they are designed to give you the tools and systems you can access in an ongoing way for your growth. So to that end, to get on the wait list for either my mentorship program, which leads you to certification, or the Blueprint Learning Program, which is really the first piece, all you have to do is go to the website, which is barebonesyoga.com, and the wait list links are right on there. Now, before I get into the content of this episode, I want to do a little body scan with you. I want you to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths. I want you to connect to your body, the feeling of your feet on the floor, and the position of your body in space. Start to connect to your bones, your muscles, maybe even squeezing the muscles in your hands, your legs, and your core. Now, I want you to shift your mind to a vision of the body. What's the first thing that comes to mind? A picture of a skeleton, maybe? A picture of a body and the muscles on it? Is the image moving? Is there one particular muscle or group of muscles that stands out in your mind? What about what's before the muscles or around the muscles? Have you ever thought about what that might be? Maybe in your mind, the skin is the first layer, but that's only the layer you see. What's under the skin? Is there something there before you get to muscle? Just take a minute and notice what stands out to you. And then sit back and let me share the journey of the body as seen during a lab training where there's access to education via a human donor whose desire it was to share their body with others for learning. Now, you may be listening to this and you may think, why does this even matter? I'm a yoga teacher. I'm not training to be a doctor. Well, as teachers learning anatomy, it can be really easy to get lost in the parts. The more we study anatomy and stick our noses into books and videos and trainings and courses, the easier it is to forget how everything works together. Even if you keep that in mind until you've actually seen it with your own eyes, like how the psoas and the breathing apparatus known as the diaphragm are actually connected, for instance, you can't get a real appreciation for how the act of breathing is actually related to movement in your hip and vice versa. Now, not every yoga teacher will have a chance or will even want to participate in an unfixed dissection experience like what I'm going to talk to you about today. But it can be helpful, if not critical, to work with a teacher who has, because their approach to teaching anatomy will be holistic and broad-based, as well as detailed and specific. And the paradox of these two approaches can really only be found once you've actually done the dissection. In other words, can only be done when you've actually done the act of going into the details and seeing them with your own eyes. Now, what I want to do is I want to walk through some of what this experience is like. So first, I'm going to kind of go through the setup. I'm going to describe for you the in-person lab experience, which I did a number of years ago, and then a virtual lab training I did last week. Now, the in-person lab experience I did a number of years ago, it was like 3 or 4 years ago, was hosted by Tiffany Cruikshank. She's a yoga teacher, and she has access to the Lab of Anatomical Enlightenment in Arizona. And then last week, I participated virtually. Of course, we couldn't go because of the COVID crisis. But there was a virtual opportunity to enroll in a week-long training hosted by Gil Headley at a lab in Colorado. Now, Gil and his team were there, so given all that is happening in the world, they were able to get to the lab and the training was held. And many, many teachers were able to log on. Gil was gracious to allow us to participate virtually, and in that training and received all the appropriate agreements from the donor's family as to allowing this access to us on a virtual basis, in addition, of course, to the folks that were there in person. So from the perspective of kind of the physical setup, there are a handful of laboratories in the United States that are either affiliated with medical schools. So the one that I visited in person in Arizona is affiliated with, I believe it was the University of Salt Lake or University of Utah at Salt Lake City. And that was their affiliation. And I'm not sure what the affiliation, if there was any, with the laboratory that Gil Headley did his training at last week. The point being, these are freestanding labs that have an educational mission that receive donors who have decided during their life to dedicate their body to education and to be used as donors in the study of the human body. And I know for the training I did a number of years ago in Arizona, many of the findings that were arrived at over the many, many years that Todd Garcia was doing, is doing his dissections, are provided back to the university because many of the donors are from Utah. And so he was able to start to amass a large amount of information about just lifestyle and its impact on health and just some of his observations. So when you enroll in one of these trainings, you are essentially going in both of these scenarios for, it's usually about a week. And in some cases, in the case of the training that I did, there were about 50 teachers and we were divided into groups of about 5 or 6, and we each had a donor to work with. In the training I participated last week in online, there seemed to be one donor who was involved, and there may have been others, but the focus was on this one donor. And so you're essentially paired up with a number of people, and you are responsible for your donor, and you perform all dissection on that one person. However, because you're in a lab setting where there are other donors, it gives you a wonderful opportunity to look at other donors, see any kind of variations from person to person, and other maybe unique things that are appearing in other people's bodies that aren't appearing in your donor's experience. So in terms of just some of the differences, things that I noticed, I would say number one, if you ever have a chance to do this virtually in lieu of never doing it at all, I would absolutely at least do that. If you have, because the experience, having done it in person and done it and having done one online last week, I can say that I had the benefit of the in-person experience, but if the only thing I had was the online experience, I would say definitely do that. I know the training I did last week with Gil Headley is an online resource. I'm not sure if he'll be making that available for purchase, even if you didn't sign up to do it when it was happening. So that's something you definitely should check into. You can just look him up on Facebook and or contact him via his website. So in terms of the process of the lab experience, these lab directors, I don't believe Gil was the director of this lab, but he's done many, it was obvious he's been there many, many times. When I attended the training in Arizona, Todd Garcia is the director of that lab. These folks have done dozens and dozens of dissections, and they have a very clear schedule and agenda and process that they take you through. So you're very supported, it's very organized, and there's a very clear pathway to what you're doing. It's a very step-by-step process, and essentially you're working from the outermost part to the innermost part. And so that's, if you want to think of it like a journey, that's essentially where you're headed. And I think now's a good time, for me to explain a little bit of the difference between doing a dissection where you have someone who's recently deceased, known as an unfixed dissection, versus one where you are working with somebody who's passed on a while back, and that's known as a fixed dissection, where things are preserved, tissues are preserved because the date that the person passed away was sometime in the past. Knowing that you really only have, I mean, in my understanding, I would probably say it's maybe a week, if not less than that. Well, probably a week, because we were there for a week in both cases, to work with an unfixed donor body without significant deterioration happening. In the scenario of the unfixed dissection, you're moving at, I don't want to say a rapid pace, but everything is there for you to work with, and you're starting from beginning to end. And in the other scenario, like for instance, when I was an undergraduate at Boston University and I was enrolled in the physical therapy program, we were in the pre-med curriculum with all the pre-med students, and all of the cadaver dissections we did there were fixed. And so everything was pretty much done for you, and you walked in on a particular day, and let's say you were examining the muscles of the shoulder, they were already dissected for you, and there were little flags and everything was labeled. There was really nothing for you to do as a student. You were simply there as an observer. In the unfixed experience, it's completely different. You are there not only as the dissector, you are there as the observer, and you're starting with someone who's very recently passed on. And so therefore you have a huge advantage to understand a lot more about the human form of the person that you're working with, because you're seeing it not only in its presentation to the eyes as you would see someone walking down the street, but you're also over the course of the week seeing it under the skin and all of what's there as well. So this gives us a tremendous opportunity to start to connect between what we see and then what we find when we look under the layers. And for yoga teachers, this is, really got broad implications, because many times as we're teaching, we may see people do certain things in their practice, and we may wonder, why is that person not listening to my cues and doing this pose with the alignment I'm suggesting? And little do we know that there's a particular relationship under the skin between muscle A and muscle B that's preventing them from doing it. Or maybe their hip joint is configured in a particular way. So these are the kinds of things that you really develop an appreciation for when you go through an experience like this, and you can begin to make observations in the first day about what you see in the person, and then you begin over the course of the days ahead to see what's under the skin, and lo and behold, by the end of the week, you begin to make some connections between what you saw on day one and what you know is in the body, which becomes revealed over the subsequent days. In terms of just this idea of, the donor themselves, I know a lot of people have questions about that particular aspect of this experience. So I want to kind of get that out on the table right on the front end here, so that if you have some questions around that, I can hopefully answer them now, and then you can, kind of open your mind to the listening of the other observations that I'll share. And I also think it's helpful to share this so that, maybe this is an option if you would be interested in doing this, or just that that this is happening, and that, again, this is available to people who are in the movement-based practices like yoga teachers, that it's not simply something that it's not just something that's available only to people on a clinical track like doctors and nurses. So essentially, as I was saying earlier, these labs have relationships with maybe a medical school, or maybe it's physicians. I'm not exactly sure of each one and all the details, but obviously the people that are there and that are brought there are recently deceased, and it was their wish to be used for educational purposes. So no one is there happenstance. The details of the donor, their name, how they died, anything about them are not revealed. All I believe the lab knows is who the contact person is, because once the lab experience is complete, the body is returned to the surviving family members for proper burial. So, know as you're listening to this, if you're having any questions or concerns or reactions, know that this was the wish of the person who has passed on. It was supported by their family. All of this is handled before they pass on so that it's, all very well laid out. And then on the final end of things, they are returned to the family for proper burial. In both experiences, the in-person one I did and the virtual one I did last week, the amount of respect shown by Gil and by Todd in the one I did a couple of years ago is, at such a high level. Everyone there really follows their lead in terms of having just such a high level of professionalism. Everything is handled with such respect and honor for the person who has decided to dedicate their life, their body, to this educational purpose. And so everything is handled with the utmost respect. And so that really infuses kind of the whole experience. Even for someone, if you're listening and you're concerned about whether or not you'd be able to do this, maybe you're a little squeamish, or you don't like the sight of blood, or you don't really, think you'd be able to handle, a dissection, actually cutting into a human body, I can assure you that it is such a fascinating experience. Once you get going, you will really lose sight of some of those concerns, because you'll be so amazed at what you're observing. And the benefit, and a lot of that is what I'm here to talk to you about today, the impressions you can come away from that experience with far outweigh any uncomfortable feelings that you might have, at least in my opinion. So I talked a little bit about the difference between a fixed and an unfixed cadaver lab experience. And, even if you live in a place where your local science museum has done the Body World exhibits, that's another example of a fixed dissection versus an unfixed. So, if you really want the true experience and to pull away the most from it, an unfixed experience is really the best one to do. So let me talk about some of the takeaways here. And so this will give you kind of an opportunity to come into the lab with me and experience a little bit of what I experienced. And I'll try in as many cases as possible to roll it up to implications for yoga teaching. Because that's really, we're not just doing this for other purposes, random purposes. We're doing this because we want to pull from it a better appreciation and understanding of the body that we can then use in our work as yoga teachers. And I think that that's important to keep in mind, especially because it reinforces our scope of practice, or should I say our scope of professional work, that we're not doing something like this because we want to start to treat people or talk to them about their abdominal organs or their cardiac status. Like, we're not doing this to try to become kind of know-it-alls or kind of share all this information with people. Well, it could be this or it could be that. It's more so that we can develop an appreciation for how the human body works, how it's structured, and how that can help us be better yoga teachers, grow our impact, be more helpful to our students, and really give us a chance to see things in real life versus just in books. So one of the things, the first thing I'll start with is just the quality of the skin and the fascia upon manipulation. So, this is where we'll get into some of the details. So you start out, of course, with the person. And so there's nothing. And I will tell you that in both experiences, the donor's face was covered by cloth. So you never really saw the donor's face. in my in-person experience, we did ultimately on the last day do dissection of the cranium into the brain and the glands in the brain. So at that point, we dissected around the orbit and the facial muscles. However, for the first 3 or 4 days, the donor's face is always covered. And that's really out of respect to that person. And until that final step, you're not really looking at the person's face during the process. So you're starting out with the body. And of course, the life has left the body. So it is the form of the person. And, you know, keeping in mind, we're always just honoring the person's memory and just our gratitude for the person that they decided to offer up their body, their physical form for educational purposes. That infuses all of the observations that we make. And so the quality of the skin, you know, because the person's recently deceased, is very lifelike. And so you're really spending the first couple of hours with the donor, just observing the quality of the skin. And in the first day that I was in the lab, we never actually did any cutting. But as we began to learn the different techniques using the scalpel and the hemostat and the different tools, and began in subsequent days to actually begin to dissect away, what was interesting to me was that it was very much an experience focused on revealing versus cutting. Right? So it wasn't like you would think maybe if you've had surgery and someone's cutting, let's say, you know, if you had your appendix taken out, I had my appendix taken out, they had to do it in an emergency situation, so they couldn't do the laparoscopy approach, they had to do the surgical approach, so they cut, right? Now they didn't make a huge cut, and of course this is a skilled surgeon, but it is cutting, right? You're cutting through skin, you're cutting through fascia, you're cutting through muscle, and then you're getting to the appendix and you're removing that. This is very different in the context of the cadaver lab dissection because you're really cutting more to reveal. And so I don't even know that cutting is the right word rather than just dissection. You're just pulling away, pulling away, pulling away, layer by layer by layer. And the layering is really what is most apparent when you do an experience like this. And, you know, that's a big takeaway that you will have from an experience like this, even if you do it virtually, how layered the body is, layer upon layer of one another. One of the other things that really was striking to me, and I'll talk a little bit about fascia in more detail as this episode progresses, but I just want to take a moment here to call out 2 particular fascial structures in the body that I had a chance in our donor to see and feel and touch and manipulate, and that is the IT band and the plantar fascia. And I remember when I looked back in preparation for recording this episode at my blog posts from back in 2016 when I had this experience, I reread this morning my observations, and I actually had plantar fasciitis while I was at the lab from doing a whole bunch of running and training for something I was doing, marathon or something. And I remember when we dissected away the skin and the superficial fascia from the plantar aspect of the foot, and we got to the plantar fascia, I literally could put my hand underneath it and pull up against it, and the thickness of that fascial connection between your heel and the base of your toes was so strong, there was no way I could pull it away. And of course, when you think about it from a functional standpoint, it's the base of each foot. So it's, you know, thankfully a very strong fascial layer. However, if you're doing a lot of running like I was, or you do a lot of standing on your feet, that can be irritated, it can get inflamed, and it takes special, it takes a different approach than what you might consider for something like a tendonitis. So let's say you had Achilles tendonitis from running. The approach might be a little bit different to treat that versus how you might address plantar fasciitis, knowing that it is fascia and not muscle. In a similar way, when we looked at the lateral stabilizers of the hip and we dissected away to reveal the IT band, that was another band of fascia, right? So plantar fascia, IT band are two distinct things in the body, where they are, plantar fascia, fascia is in the name, iliotibial band or iliotibial tract doesn't have the word fascia in it, but when you look at it in the body, it's definitely white. It is not red. It's not vascular like a muscle. So you pretty much know something's up, even if you didn't know it was fascia. You know, when you look at it, this is not muscle. And just like plantar fascia, very strong, you could stick your hand under it. It was like a big, thick guitar string down the lateral aspect of the thigh, inserting on the knee. And we know from, people's complaints in yoga classes, they sometimes point to that lateral aspect of their knee, that outer aspect of their knee, and they say, oh, something's hurting me here. I don't quite know what it is. And sometimes it possibly is the IT band and that connection being irritated from maybe some repetitive movement they're doing. So another thing that we observed, or another observation I had from these experiences, both of them, is just this, this power of using observation and the power of using that first before dissecting. And, this was so interesting for us in my group, and even in the virtual experience I did last week. A lot of what you saw in the first day, and these lab directors and Gil was asking us to comment on, what do you see? Notice when you look at the donor here, what do you see? What stands out to you? Is one leg longer than the other? Is one hip higher than the other? Like anything that you might observe. And then as the days go on and you begin the dissection, many times you begin to see under the skin the reason for those differences or those qualities that you saw when it was prior to the dissection. And this is really important for yoga teachers to keep in mind. And, for myself, when I train teachers on anatomy, one of the first things I start with is an in-depth review of anatomical position and some of the qualities of that, and what those qualities are in their translation to poses, right? So if you say anatomical position is feet at hip width, well, what are postures where your feet are at hip width, and what's the significance there? What are the sensations in the body when we stand at hip width versus bring the feet together? What are some of the benefits of feet hip width versus together from a balancing perspective? How can we use this in the body or in our teaching to help our students or to help particular kinds of students? So the power of observation for teachers, for yoga teachers, is a critical skill to build. And as it turns out, for us as teachers, like I was saying before, there's a lot of things we may see in our students, but we are definitely working at a disadvantage to know what the reasons are behind what we see. And, especially when we're teaching group classes, it can be very challenging for us to kind of figure out what kinds of cues can we use that are generally acceptable or generally applicable, but yet still take into account some things that we anticipate might be an issue for some students if they have some particular thing or another happening in their body. And so, once you do a dissection experience like this, it will really open your mind to just this appreciation that we really can't ever know what's going on. And I think that that's a really important realization for yoga teachers in particular to come to, because there is a lot in the industry that has to do with right and wrong, and the right thing to say and the wrong thing to say, and this is this and this is always that. And you really come to find out, ironically, the more you learn about the body, that it's really hard to say, things are always this way and that way. We really kind of live more in the area of nuance. And certainly when you do dissection, you begin to see some of the nuance in the body, even when you're starting from, oh, well, this is the heart. Well, this is the aorta. Oh, wow, look at in this person what they have here growing off of their aorta. Isn't that interesting, right? So never can really know. And I think that just brings a certain humble attitude that we definitely want to always have as teachers. The other thing that I noticed in both experiences was just the plethora of muscles in just one region and how they overlap. So when you look at the shoulder and the hip, just how many muscles are, I don't even want to say crammed in that one space, but just in that one area. And, the implications for us as teachers here is significant. Our students are going to be coming to us saying, hey, as they point to their shoulder, I have a pain right here. What do you think this is from? Or, hey, I feel, uncomfortable when I come into a little push-up right here. And they're going to be pointing to some specific spot on their shoulder, or they might point to a specific spot on their hip. And I'm not necessarily saying you have to do lab dissection to have this appreciation. I'm sharing with you my observations to kind of relate some of these concepts with you in an effort to, kind of hope that you start to appreciate some of these things as well. This idea here that it's really hard to point to one spot and know exactly what the issue is, especially again in our limited capacity at as yoga teachers. And I don't mean that limited in that we're not able to do a lot and make an impact. It's just we can't see, we're not doing imaging, we're not doing muscle testing, we're not working one-on-one in most cases with students. So, the more we kind of understand the layering of muscles, and oh man, you really, really see that in the lab. You're peeling away pec major, under there is pec minor, you're peeling away below, you're getting into the ribs, now you're seeing subscapularis on the inner aspect of the scapula. You're in the back of the body, you're looking at the trapezius, you're pulling that back, you're seeing the rhomboids. So you're beginning to really see the layering and the interconnectedness of all the muscles. And, as we're teaching and people have these questions for us after class, that really can help us as we have this appreciation, create an approach to helping them that's really broad-based, right? That's really looking at it from the point of view of, hey, I hear you. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Well, it hurts when I do this. Okay, great. Well, is that something that only happens when you're in yoga, or is that something that happens all the time for you? Oh, it happens only when I'm in yoga. Okay, so let's take a look at your alignment. Okay, so now that we've honed in on that, let's take a look at some things where you're moving in that particular way, and let's look at some things, some poses, or maybe you're doing something that's the opposite of that. So it's always kind of a broad-based suggestion that kind of gets at the issue from multiple angles and then puts the onus on the person to do the work, to do the research, to continue the observing of their own body, and then come back to us and say, hey, I did what you suggested for a number of days. Here I am, it's a week later. I'm here to take your class again. I want to give you some feedback about how my body responded to what you suggested. What do you think? So it's, again, a partnered approach rather than one where you have to feel like you have all the answers. Another thing that was really interesting in both scenarios, both lab experiences I had, was the importance and the observation we did of the gliding between the fascial layers and the muscles, and how in teaching without good slide and glide, range of motion can be quite limited. So remember, I actually have an earlier podcast from last year on fascia in general, and I can link that up in the show notes so you can listen to that if you missed it. Fascia is a completely separate system, but yet so interconnected with the body. It's different from muscle. It's a connective tissue layer. It goes and weaves in between all the structures in our body and provides us with structural support, as well as has its own very distinct qualities. It's comprised of kind of a liquid, kind of a viscous, I don't even want to say layer, but portion, collagen fibers, and provides the body with structural support, as well as an ability to be somewhat buoyant. And because it is in between and underneath and around, it's really hard to ever separate it. However, because it is different from muscle and has different qualities, how we handle it and how we treat it can be looked at as a little bit different. So you might go to the gym and lift weights for your muscles, but in the gym, you might use a foam roller for your fascia. And even though in both cases you're working both things, one is more geared towards fascia, keeping in mind its qualities and how they differ from muscle, and one, i.e. lifting weights, is more geared towards muscle fiber growth. So that's, kind of a little bit of the difference there. Now, because of the presence of fascia under the skin, so when you do the dissection, when I was saying before about cutting to reveal, right, you're cutting through the skin, you're cutting through skin, which we see, the epidermal layer, the superficial fascia, and then getting to deep fascia. But even before you get to deep fascia, that superficial fascia is the first layer of fascia that you hit. And this is typically what is thrown away when you do fixed, or when you experience fixed cadaver lab dissections. You never see that superficial fascial layer. And in fact, for many years, that was just kind of taken and discarded, and no one really thought that there was any significance to it. And it's really only been, I'm guessing, maybe over the past 10 years or so, that the study of fascia has become more of its own area. There's the Fascial Congress, which I think it's the Fascial Congress Society. I'm not sure of the exact name of the organization, but they have an annual conference every year just about fascia, right? So people like Gil Headley and John Sharkey and Jill Miller, these are experts in this area, in addition to being movement professionals. And John Sharkey's a clinical anatomist. And, these are people who devote their lives in part to the study of fascia. So, thank goodness for that, because, now we have all this body of research about how fascia is different and distinct, and yet part of at the same time. And so when we think of it as different and distinct, but yet part of, we begin to appreciate, and when you see it in the body, it's unbelievable. You see that skin, epidermis, adipose layer, and then superficial fascia, and then deep fascia, and then muscle. And the slide and glide I was talking about refers to just the relationship between those layers. And, when you have a trigger point, when you have a spot in your body that feels uncomfortable, start to think about what is the potential relationship, and is that relationship misaligned between those layers. In many cases, that's what things like massage and acupuncture and using foam rollers and MFR balls gets to. It's an addressing of that lack of mobility between those layers, as well as an ability or a technique designed to speak to the nerves and the sensory receptors that are in those layers that communicate with the nervous system, and bring a certain level of tone to a muscle that maybe needs to be downregulated, so that the person doesn't experience things like trigger points or cramps or just tightness in that particular part of the body. So that whole idea of slide and glide is a huge one for just looking at the body as a system, thinking about people moving on the yoga mat, thinking about when somebody's doing a pose and they might look a little discombobulated. Start to think about it from the perspective of, man, I wonder if there's some kind of lack of mobility because fascial layer to muscle is a little bit restricted in this person. Another thing that we noticed when I did the in-person experience was this whole observation we did in our donor of the head of the humerus as it relates to the muscles of the rotator cuff. And in our donor, we observed a great amount of limited range of motion in her shoulder, and noises. When we were moving her on the first day, moving her limbs, we felt a lot of what's called joint crepitus. It kind of feels like creakiness. You might even have some in your own body. And then once we got down to dissecting, we could see that the head of the humerus and the glenoid fossa of the scapula was quite deteriorated. We could see, because of that deterioration, how the head of the humerus was really pressing against the muscles of the rotator cuff. So that's, if you think again of SITS, so it's supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis, and just the increased mobility and lack of support that our donor's shoulder had. And we started to think, because most of us in that lab experience were yoga teachers, we started to think about, well, even in a healthy person without joint crepitus, what kind of movement might they have of head of the humerus against rotator cuff muscles if they weren't, using good structural support for their body when doing things like moving from high to low push-up or doing balancing poses like crow, doing handstands, even not handstands, even just anything where you're weight bearing, plank, cat-cow, chaturanga, low plank for sure, crow, as I said, things where we're weight bearing on the arms, where the palms are pronated, facing down, where there might not be good support from the rest of the body to prevent everything from sinking into the upper body. And so this is where, for me, when I work with teachers in training, I'm really always emphasizing the importance of cueing to other less obvious parts of the body so that your students will be able to recruit other muscles to help the primary muscles they're probably thinking are supposed to be doing all the work, which in fact are not really supposed to be doing all the work. It's supposed to be a collaborative effort. And, again, in this particular instance, cueing people, let's say in low push-up, to using certain muscles in their core, certain muscles in their legs, can really help out their upper body and prevent that kind of push of the head of the humerus against the muscles of the rotator cuff. The other thing that was really interesting about fascia is that fascia actually has multiple times as many, we heard 6 times as many neurons versus any other organ in your body. And so this makes your fascia much stronger in terms of understanding kind of the sensations in your body. And that was really interesting to us, because we're, again, I think a lot of people don't actually think about fascia. They think about the body like bones and muscles. And maybe when I started this episode out and asked you in your meditation and your visualization, what do you see the body like? I would be curious to know if fascia came to mind, because for most people it won't. They'll think bone and muscle. And you can think also about fascia as the body's tension system. So John Sharkey, that I mentioned before, he's a clinical anatomist. And he, in one of his writings, you can even just Google it, it's called tensegrity. And it's this architectural concept that really refers to the body's kind of buoyancy and structure like a tension system that is in part contributed to by or created by the presence of fascia. And if you kind of think of it like, the femur and its connection with the tibia in the lower leg, it's not as if, we're constantly wearing down our knees in that articulation there, that joint articulation. And that's in part because the body has some buoyancy. We're kind of supported by this almost pressure system where the fascia provides kind of this contained system, and the bones provide, a contained system as well, where the fascia, I guess, is more of a continuous layer. And one, that contained structure of the bones against the continuous system of the fascia provides kind of a sense of intersystem pressure that provides a sense of buoyancy and prevents bones from just kind of constantly crashing against one another. So, this whole idea of the buoyancy in the body, I think as yoga practitioners, we definitely feel, but it's something to keep in mind when we think about, what's kind of holding us up. And, in many presentations I've seen about fascia, that statement, fascia is what kind of holds us up, has come up. Tom Myers, who's another expert in this area, talks about fascia almost like the container that your muscles are poured into. I've also seen some images that, kind of suggest fascia is kind of like your Spider-Man suit, and the muscles are contained there within. So that's just some visuals for you there. And then just a couple other observations. One of the things that really stood out for me was the layering of the abdominal muscles. And certainly in fitness, we talk about core, but when you do dissection and even just in normal studies of anatomy, you really begin to appreciate just the layering between the rectus abdominis, the internal obliques, the external obliques, the transversus abdominis, their relationship to the organs of the internal organs there, and just their relationship to one another, and how this has implications for us as teachers. You know, are we just using words like core when we teach? I mean, I know we say Uddiyana Bandha. Are we helping people understand that that's in part the action of the rectus abdominis? Are we helping them engage their transversus abdominis? Do they even understand what that is? Do we even understand that as teachers? Do we know how to cue to that and when it would be helpful? I mean, this is all part of when I train teachers on anatomy, the distinctions that I help them understand, because it really ups the impact of your teaching if you can speak to things in a little bit more of a specific and practical way than just saying things like core and glutes and open your hip, all these just kind of basket phrases that are out there in yoga teaching that without the requisite knowledge behind it, it's really difficult to answer questions, to create anatomically based sequencing, to create anatomically based cueing that really helps people learn about their body. So that's all behind kind of why the approach to learning is the way it is, at least in the programs that I offer. And the last thing I want to just bring up, which was so interesting in both cases, just this idea that the body is super smart and it will look for ways to support a part that's not functioning well, or will work around it as much as it can to keep things functioning. I know in several of the cadavers that we had in my original training, we saw some really interesting things, people that had surgical interventions, so knee replacements, shoulder replacements. That's obviously when you get to a point where your body can't kind of work around it, you need a surgical intervention. But we also saw things like changes in the shape of arteries, growths in places where growth shouldn't be, muscles that had grown over, growths that had appeared, just as a workaround. So, the point being, the body is kind of designed, and in its intelligence, it will work around things until it really has no choice. And, some of these things are things that we're not going to know until they present themselves as problems to us. I mean, this, from a preventative health standpoint, is why all of the preventative testing that you can possibly get, you should get, because you don't want to wait to find out that there's some kind of issue going on that your body's worked around until it gets to a serious point. The earlier you can get to some of these things, the better. And, in a lot of cases, visual imagery, MRIs, and X-rays are the only way to know that they're there, unless it's something where you're having some kind of functional limitation because of it. But the other thing, even outside that kind of clinical presentation or clinical issue, for us as yoga teachers is to understand that, when we're working with people and we're cueing them through a yoga practice, we may see them do something in a different way than what we're saying. And many times it's not because they're not hearing what we're saying, it's because there's something going on. Let's just stay at the level of muscle and fascia and bone and joint. There's something happening in one of those systems that has created a workaround. The person hears us, they know on an intellectual level what we want them to do. However, there's some limitation there, and the body is going to figure out a way to get that done as best as it can. And so this is where, really without working with somebody one-on-one, we're not really going to be able to figure out what it is. But if we're teaching mainly group classes, which I know a lot of you are, it really does make the case for just teaching in a way where you're giving highly accessible cues. You're not honing in, to like offering things that are just super specific for certain groups of people, like maybe one or two people in your classes, just kind of presenting things in a high level way and recognizing that we are teaching group classes, that we're not doing private sessions. And our main goal is to keep people moving and get as much benefit as they can out of the experience. So we've reached the end of our journey here today. I mentioned earlier about the anatomy work group and how the videos are in there. with the examples of the cues and running them through the cues evaluation tool. So if you're not part of that, you can just send me an invite, send me a request to join. It's the Bare Bones Yoga Anatomy Work Group. And then don't forget, if all of this kind of learning and content is something that you want more of in your life, sign up for my Blueprint Learning Program. That is my signature program to teach teachers anatomy, but it's really more than that. It's really how to bring anatomy in practical ways into your teaching. So it's not just the content. Teachers get the content in their 200-hour trainings, and quite frankly, every single teacher that enrolls in my Blueprint Learning Program is a 200-hour graduate, and they feel like they just didn't get the practical application. It's not a fault of anything, it's just kind of the way things have become because of the way the path is kind of typically laid out for teachers. But I've really created programs to support teachers in a way that the typical path is not. And I don't do that to say my way is better and their way is not. I do it as a supplement, and I really do it as a niche for those teachers who have, I don't even want to say the revelation, but the recognition that, hey, you know what? I've got a learning gap here around anatomy, and I want to fill that gap. I don't want to take a general training program, 300 hours, 500 hours. I want to take something specific that's really honing in on anatomy. And that's what my program is all about. So the Blueprint Learning Program, you can get on the wait list so that when I open enrollment next month, you'll be one of the first to know. And the waitlist link is right on my website. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode today. And if you have any questions, you can always send me an email, Karen@barebonesyoga.com. See you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I am your host, Karen Fabian, and I just want to remind you, if you would like to get on the wait list for my 2 premier programs, the Blueprint Learning Program and my mentorship program, all you need to do is visit my website, barebonesyoga.com, and the links to get on the wait list for both of these programs are right on the homepage. Thanks for listening, and see you on the next episode.